Well, we have an interesting topic today from the BYU Library Family History Center. That's our new official title. And the question here is, what if your ancestors ended up in jail? And that's entirely possible. We would all like to think of our ancestors as great people who are rich and famous. In fact, one of the primary reasons why people go into learning about genealogy is they hear that their ancestor was some king of Europe or king in Europe or someplace. And so they're going to go back and find their royal ancestor. That's been an incentive for a very long time. I don't know that there's very many people who have an incentive when they find out that the family tradition was that their ancestor was a crook. That doesn't seem to have the same allure for doing genealogical research. So what happens when we're in that situation? Sometimes we do find out after we're doing research that some of our ancestors were not famous, they were infamous. They were the type of people who did end up in jail for some reason. This occurs in a lot of different contexts, and you can explore this topic for quite a long period of time. When you're researching your ancestors, a person might suddenly disappear from a record. The other side of that is an ancestor may suddenly appear in the records when neither one of them would. Both of those situations cause some difficult times for genealogical research. It's possible that disappearing from the record could be attributed to a lot of different causes, one of which is dying and not ever being found, and nobody ever found the body or anything, and that's the end of it. That's why they don't appear in any of the records that you might encounter. And that's not as uncommon as you might think, especially during times when records and communication weren't that good. Another one is obviously when people walk away and decide they don't want to be found again. And that also is fairly common. And I've come across that and managed to find subsequent records that were unknown to the family in the family tradition. And the list can go on, but one of the ones that causes that very frequently is more frequently than others, is that the person ends up in jail or prison or ends up in slavery, or something else happens that, or as I mentioned before we started, as an indentured servant. So all of these can happen. And you might have some kind of family tradition about so-and-so, he was a very bad person and that he ended up in jail, or even that that he was murdered or killed or whatever, or was a murderer and killer, and all of those things. It's not as common as you might think because people don't talk about it at all. But if there is something and it's closer in time than, say, very early times. If it were in the colonial times, for example, that tradition may never have made it to the present. You may never have heard that tradition. If it was 2 or 3 generations back, you probably have heard something about the family not being exactly what everyone else expects. Understand that I just mentioned this, but I'll summarize it again. Confinement can include lots of different things. You could have been arrested, or the equivalent of what an arrest is, which is a stopping of a person's activities in some way. By the way, as an attorney, an arrest is a very specific thing. Arrest is whenever you are detained by an officer of the law. If you are detained for even just 30 seconds, you are technically under arrest, meaning stopped from doing your regular activities. Whether it becomes an official arrest, which most people think about as being booked or being entered into the records of having been arrested, then that's a different level. So there's kind of a distinction there that is made not commonly by people outside the law. Might also include prisons, jails, prisons, poorhouses, mental institutions, concentration camps, and many other types of restrictions. So we sometimes think of people having to commit a crime and then being arrested after kind of investigation or in the process of committing a crime, and then they get sent to jail, and then they're in jail and whatever. Or if it's serious enough, they get sent to prison, which is a more long-term situation, unless in some situations the jails were very, very, very long-term. And this particular one, for example, this is an evacuation part. It illustrates the evacuation of Japanese Americans from West Coast during World War II and putting into them in this particular one is the Santa Anita Reception Center. There was reception centers here in Utah. There's reception centers in Arizona, and most of all of the Western states. And they were obviously detained without their consent. They weren't asked if they would like to be put into a containment camp. And that's the same thing that happens with people who are very poor. We don't necessarily have poorhouses anymore, although we do criminalize a lot of behavior that results from people being poor. So, for example, what we talked about constantly in the background in the United States is homelessness. People who are homeless. And the homeless people are people who have no fixed place of living, can be voluntary. In other words, people can walk away and decide they want to be homeless, or they might be forced out to being homeless. I have spent a lot of years of my life involved with the homeless population. For 3 years, I worked at I served, I didn't work there, but I served at a Catholic relief kitchen in Mesa, Arizona. And other than that, I was very much involved in learning about, studying, and being involved in that. But so this is a really kind of complicated thing. It sounds simple. It sounds like, oh, somebody robbed a bank or somebody shot somebody or somebody assaulted somebody and they got arrested and then they got sent to jail and then they got out. I mean, it's like every movie that we have or television series that we have with detectives and police and of any different kinds. So there's all different kinds of things. We have a common view of what that's like, but unfortunately, that common view does not include all of the different iterations of what can happen to a person when they become basically unable to take care of themselves in some way due to their own actions or due to their condition or due to their status or due to their race or some other category that's been imposed. So we'll move on and give some of this. To start out with, just to give a way to get into this in the very beginning, is you may be able to trace an ancestor to a prison using the U.S. federal census records. It isn't a bad idea if you really cannot find this person and they seem to disappear. Either a husband or a wife disappears, or a child or someone disappears and just goes away. It would be a good idea to broaden your census search. It may be that all of the U.S. Census records now have been digitized, and there's some of the records, by the way, the auxiliary records, which are not part of the main population schedules, that are difficult to find. I have to freely admit that we've had some trouble looking for mortality schedules recently, but by and large, the main population schedules are all available, and so you might actually find a person in an institution. Now, you look at this list of people in the institution here on the U.S. Census, in this example that I've got, and you'll see something that's interesting. None of them have an actual name. So it's going to be a little bit hard to identify who that is. But there are actual records, and that's kind of the point of this presentation, is you can go beyond a census record and actually find out who these people are through through records that more likely do exist, but are not necessarily in the mainstream of the records that are now being digitized for genealogy purposes. One of the most common ways that you'll find some information is in a newspaper. This is just a regular newspaper article page, and you'll see a list of all the people here that were either killed or there was a robbery or there was somebody who was arrested and charged. So this is kind of what you call a rap sheet in a sense. It's not the rap sheet from the police, but it's the newspaper's list of reporting everybody who was arrested and sent to jail. Obviously, some of these arrests are going to result in a person being in jail for less than 24 hours. Some may be in a jail for a matter of days or weeks or months. And there are some who obviously are going to be transferred to the prison system and be in prison for years and perhaps until they die. And of course, people do die in prison. So this is, this is not totally unusual. You always, with this, unlike anything that goes on in genealogy, you may be surprised at what you find. And you may or may not have heard of Tombstone, Arizona, but this is the cemetery in Tombstone, and it's actually it was a real cemetery. It wasn't it's not something that was created just to be called a cemetery. This is a real cemetery for Tombstone. These records of tombstones that there are sometimes a little bit unusual and sometimes quite funny, but basically they represent real people who were really involved in the system. And this is where they ended up, was in the county jail and then killed by a mob. So it's an interesting place to go if you ever get down to southern Arizona and want to go to Tombstone. It's actually a paid place. They have to charge. They charge so they can keep it looking like this. This one is not. This is the Yuma State Prison, and which no longer is a state prison, but this is the cemetery. And they do have a partial list. They never have been able to get the entire list, but they do have, and it's this kind of it's not an attraction. It's right across the street from the prison buildings, and just out of downtown Yuma, and it's a place where there's a list of people that are buried there, and there's no grave markers. It's only the research and the information that's available there on the site that can tell you or the identity of these people. I'm sure if you go online, you can find the list of people who they know are buried in the Yuma State Prison. So it's the type of thing that you may be discovering it when you start looking for a death record, and that may bring you to the point where you see that this person died in a prison or was buried in a prison cemetery or a mental hospital cemetery or a concentration camp or any number of other ways that this person was prevented from having freedom and then passed away. So this is the Yuma, Arizona Territorial Prison Cemetery. Okay. It's important also to understand, this is really something that's helpful to understand, and that is your relative didn't have to be a criminal to end up in prison. People ended up in prison for a lot of reasons. In early days, imprisonment for debt was very common, very, very common. If you couldn't pay your bills, you got sent to jail because that's what they did. And you may end up for a long term in the prison because you never get the resources to get out, and you may be in there for a long period of time. These people in this photo should be quite familiar to people living in Utah. These people were men that were arrested and sent to prison for plural marriage or polygamy. during the 1800s primarily, and into the 1900s to some extent. And they weren't bad people. They just had done something which was counter to what the laws of the society had created in about a certain cultural and religious organization. So they went to prison. And it's not unusual to find that, although it may be difficult, by the way, to find their records. And one thing you're going to find, as I mentioned just as we were talking before this presentation, your ancestor may also have been transported to another part of the world, because that was a way that was commonly not so much for the United States. The whole process of transportation relied upon a real colonial type of situation. So the countries that had vast colonial enterprises like Britain and France and Spain and so forth could take advantage of the fact that they had colonies to ship out the people they didn't want in the main country. So if you lived in England and you were a pauper and you stole a loaf of bread, for example, you could be put on a boat and held for a period of time, and then get a sentence of this is a prison ship, so you might be out in the harbor on this boat for a period of time, up to a year or more. And then when you were the whole process had passed and you were sentenced in transportation, they would put you on another boat and ship you off. And we often think about that as being to Australia, because they made kind of a big deal of that there in Australia. But there were equally as number of people who went to thousands and thousands of these convicts went to the Caribbean islands, and many, many, many thousands and thousands more went to the United States, or to what's now the United States, the colonies in the United States. And England was not the only one transporting people around the world, because there were French that did it, and some of the other countries too. The issue here with genealogy, of course, is that this is the disappearing person. This is the person that may appear in one census record, and then there's no death record, nothing that says the person died. There's nothing that tells what happened to the person. And it's just impossible. Now, all the people who were transported to another place were not criminals. It wasn't just for criminals. In England, there was, during the mid 1800s, there were laws passed, and what they did was the parishes did not particularly want to have poorhouses or workhouses, because that was a cost of money. It was a constant expense to the parish. And so the government devised a way that they could subsidize the poor people in an area and encourage them to immigrate. So then they would put them on a ship and ship them primarily to Australia. So that was something that happened that was happening after the American Revolution. So they no longer could send people to the United States, because obviously it was a separate country, and the United States wasn't happy to receive British's poor people, particularly. So they went off, and there was a whole thing that was set up that allowed that to happen. So how do we know about the confinement, and where are the records? So these are the two main issues. And it's not something that we're able to just say, go look here, and this is where you will find them, because that isn't the situation. Every one of the institutions, the prisons or jails, had records. Obviously, they had records. Whether those records were preserved, to the extent that they were preserved, there's lots of records like that we deal with in genealogy. It's like church records, and it's like school records. It's like employment records. It's like union records, like railroad records, and all of those different types of records that could and are valuable genealogical resources. it doesn't necessarily mean that those resources are very easy to find or that they're organized in any way that makes sense to the person who is trying to do the research. And in many cases, they take a tremendous amount of effort on the part of the researcher to get through to them, to get to the point where you know where these records are and gain access to the records that have existed. Now, I'm just going to get into that as we go. But as I mentioned, you may find the situation that starting with a note in the U.S. federal census records. So it's always a good idea to make sure that the person you see that didn't seem to be in the place where you thought that they might be or didn't seem to have any other information about them, it could very well be somebody in the prison. So this particular census schedule is from the 1920 census, and it's for San Quentin in California. And you can see that there's quite a bit of information here about the person, and it should help you find this individual. And actually, I have found those ancestors that I know were in prison, and I have more than one. I have quite not a, you would say a lot, but I do have a few. And of the few that I have, one of them does show up in the census record, and that's how I knew he was in prison because there was no other mention. I've tried to find newspaper records or whatever, and he most likely, my guess from the records that I had was he was imprisoned because of tax evasion. They probably didn't do anything terrible. He just didn't pay his taxes, but I guess that's severe enough to get sent to prison. There's newspapers articles. So this is a weekly paper that talks about the war prison camp at Fort Douglas in Utah overlooking the Salt Lake Valley. That was a prison camp and a containment. And this is one of the German prison camps. And there's a story. We lived in Arizona a long time, and right outside of Phoenix on the border between Phoenix and Scottsdale, in the Papago Park area. If you're familiar with Phoenix, that would mean something, but it doesn't matter. There was a containment camp for German prisoners, and there was a story told. When this is one of those high school stories or things that you hear passed around. I call them alligator stories about alligators in the sewer. Which, by the way, there were alligators in the canals in Phoenix, and when I heard these stories, it was just my inclination. I guess that's how I ended up being a genealogist for so many years. Was whenever I heard a story, I have to go out and see if I can verify it or turn it into a myth. The myth was that there was some Germans in the containment camp who got a hold of a map somehow and saw that there was a river running by not too far from the camp called the Salt River. And so they went to the trouble of just surreptitiously building some boats and things and then escaped out of the camp, where their plan was to go down the Salt River, down to the Gila River where it joins, and then on down to the Colorado River and into Mexico. So they were just going to float down the river. Well, unfortunately, they didn't understand that by that period in time, during the war, the Salt River didn't have any water in it. It was a dry bed. And for the most part, it still is. So when they got there, they had a surprise that they weren't necessarily going to float down the river. Now, those are the kinds of things that get passed down, and those people are real. Now, I did the research on that, and that was an actual reported instance. It wasn't a myth or, as I said, an alligator story. And so I need to show the types of documents that are about a criminal that may be found. And so here we have a list of a man in England who lived from in 1816 to 1901, and these are the records that we have gathered primarily that I found in England and in Australia about his crime, his conviction, his incarceration. And I thought it would be helpful to go through the process sort of generally so you would understand. Of course, jurisdictions are going to vary in the records that they keep, and there's going to be difficulty in finding out what happened to the people. There's a question that's popped in about family member who dies in Folsom Prison, but they can't find any burial information. And that is almost the absolute issue. That's one of the major issues is it's going to be and I'll get into that because I have another example of that and explain a little bit about what happens in those situations because it's not unusual and it's very likely that there is no record of a burial. Okay, so here's Edward Rodwell. It's not Redwell, it's Rodwell. And he was born in 1816, and these are the records that we found. And he's in a parish register, and he gets married, all of that kind of thing. But the main part of what happened to him was that he was based in and was convicted of a crime of theft and was transported to Australia. And then he got married to one of my direct line ancestors. And then and I'll explain all this when we get there. So there's the newspaper. So this is just an extremely, newspapers love to report criminal. It's going on today. If you go down through a list of news articles like on Google or any one of the other news services, you're basically going to see a lot of articles about shootings and a lot of articles about thefts and all sorts of every time somebody gets sent to jail who has any notoriety, any visibility in the world, it basically ends up in the news. Well, this was a 21-year-old Edward Rodwell and his accomplice, John Bly, and they burglarized a house. And the house is identified, and they stole razors and a microscope, and they were found in Rodwell's house. And their footprints were found in the newly mowed lawn. I mean, if you watch a lot of mystery stories, I don't know if being a lawyer means you're going to be interested in mysteries. I doubt it. I doubt that that's a thing. But it turns out that a lot of the lawyers I know are mystery aficionados and watch the news about everything. But in addition to that, they found their footprints. They didn't find anything in Bly's house, and Bly was acquitted, but Rodwell was found guilty. And this is the point. He was sentenced to 14 years transportation. And that's going to become important as I go through this because the transportation meant that he was going to be sent to, in this case, Australia, because 1837. So that's where he was going to end up eventually. So here is the register of all persons charged with indictable offenses in the assize and sessions. Those are the court sessions within the county during the year in 1837. So this is Norfolk. And Edward Rodwell shows up here. And this is what it says. It says his birth date, it says his date of his trial was 1st August, 1837, the trial year 1837. And it was in Norfolk. And his sentence ended up being transportation. So here's the entry right out of this particular register. Now understand this. The reason that I'm going through this process is because these records exist. These particular English records have been digitized and are available. And these primarily came from findmypast.com and some from the British archives and some from other records in Australia, for example, and the boat records. So those are the kinds of things that you're looking for. So here's another list of individuals, and these people were being held on a ship. This is the prison ship sitting out in the bay someplace. This one happened to be moored in Woolwich, and he was convicted date, and he was convicted in Norwich, and so it has the date that he was received, so we can see that he was arrested, he was charged, he was held in the jail someplace, and in the jail for the court, and then he was convicted. And in this case, since he was judged to be transported and sentenced to be transported, he was being held pending the transportation. In other words, they just didn't have a ship sitting out there for every one of the guys being convicted. They were primarily men, but they did do it women. Women were not totally exempt from this particular issue. There were a lot of women who were also sent to Australia. Not a lot, less than the men, but a substantial number. That's something you can look it up. If you want to know how many women were transported to Australia, you can look up that on Google and find that exact number. So here's another record. Okay, so these are all lists of all the people who were on that particular situation. And this is the vessel Waterloo, and he was convicted, and it was 1837. And you can see it was August, September, October before he was put on a boat, set to be sent off to New South Wales. And so here he is on a boat on his way to Australia. And this is what happened when he got there. You can see at the bottom, this is from the Archive Authority of New South Wales, and says the information, et cetera, et cetera. It's the usual disclaimer. But this one says Edward Rodwell was from 1837 to 1842, arrived in New South Wales, Australia, and this is the records relating to convict vessels. And it's a partial index. The convicts arrived L to Z from 1837 to 1842, and volume 4, 4,528, whatever that number is. Probably the number of convicts that were on these particular records. Okay, so here he is in Australia. This is another ship record. This is a transcribed record. Obviously, it's printed, so it's a lot easier to read and a lot easier to get to, but there's a lot more information here in this particular record. And what it does is they, over on the right-hand side where it says particular marks or scars, then everything about the marks and scars on these people were identified so that they could be traced down. Obviously, back in this time period, they did not have photography. This is before photography occurred. So he was in New South Wales by 1838, and it says he's 21, he's convicted in Norfolk on the Waterloo, and he arrived on 8 February 1838. So it was October, February. He was in the boat for a while. So that gives you some idea how long it took for people to get down to New South Wales from England. Now we have another record here of what happened to him. Now, why these records? Now, you say, oh, yeah, there's all these records, but where are you going to find all these records? The answer is we found them all, and they were, we took the research to dig into the records. And as I mentioned, most of these records came from findmypast.com and from the regular sources where you would go look for records. You just had to look for them. Did they show up? Did people previously show this up? In all the records that I've done, and this is, it's rare enough. There's other ones of them. I'll mention them and show some of the records that exist, but it's not that common. But it doesn't mean that the records aren't there, and especially if your ancestor ended up in Australia, and in some cases in America, then you may want to see if those records are available. And if they show they're transported, this chain of records is discoverable. And it gives you a lot of information about the person and a lot of other people who came with that person, which may answer other questions that you you may find when you get to looking for research in Australia, for example. So this is what happened. The next step was that he's now 23 years old. So it's been 2 years since he was convicted. And his arrival year is in 1837 into Australia. And he arrived on that. And he got the date of admission and photo by 4041. They're starting to try to get a photo of the person. And he was put in the Newcastle jail, Gaol jail. And the jail location was Newcastle. And this is the record. So here he comes in. And when he didn't get out of jail, he got shipped over to Australia and put back in a jail in Australia. So he was stuck in that jail for a while. So eventually, he obtained what was called a conditional pardon. And it says that Edward Rodwell, who's described, was convicted in Norfolk and so forth of housebreaking. And for this and consideration, he has good conduct since his arrival. He was recommended for a pardon and obtained a pardon. Okay, so would you read? I mean, you could consider this person to be a criminal, but it wasn't the kind of crime that would occasion such a severe use of the prison system as they have today. That's not to say that we don't have a huge problem with prisons in the United States. It's just to say that this is how it was handled. And after a period of time, by 1837, he was, that's when he first got there. But by the time of this pardon, he was then allowed to live in Australia. Now, nobody was going to ship him back to England or anything until his whole transportation was, but when he was pardoned, that cut short the time that the sentence of transportation. He didn't have to stay in Australia for 14 years. He was able to do whatever he wanted at that point. So now we see that he was granted permission to marry. That was encouraged. Obviously, they wanted to create people in Australia who were supporting themselves and their families and solidifying Britain's claim to the colony. And so this basically was something that was very much encouraged. Now, Sarah Parkinson is important because she's one of my ancestors. And now we have the marriage record for Edward Rodwell, and this one is Eliza Parkinson. And this, I'm going to have to explain what happened here because this is actually what happened. He was a farmer and she was a laborer, and he was 43 years old by this time. So he'd been working more or less around 15, 20 years as a blacksmith until he finally got married. Okay, in that range. So this is what actually happened. This is the results. Eliza Parkinson's brother, Thomas Parkinson, married Mary Ann Bryant. Their daughter, Eliza Ellen Parkinson, married Henry Martin Tanner, my great-grandfather. So he married Eliza Parkinson. And Sarah Parkinson was the one that married Rodwell, and he left with Sarah's sister and went back to England and got married again. There was a divorce, and then she got married again and to his sister, and then Rodwell and his descendants ended up in England, and it's just a regular family, and that's a lot of research has gone into their family. And so she remarried to Sarah Parkinson after Rodwell left. She remarried Charles Stapley Jr. and their daughter, Emma Ellen Stapley, also married my great-grandfather, Henry Martin Tanner. So I don't know how you say this, but basically I'm related to both sides of this family and to the Stapleys and the Bryants and the Parkinsons in a kind of a complicated way. So my grandfather, Leroy Parkinson Tanner, was the son of Henry Martin and Eliza Ellen Parkinson, who was kind of in the middle of all this. So getting on so that you don't think that it's just a single type, well, yeah, that was just strange. Here, by the way, is an unlawful cohabitation case for one of my great-grandfathers, my great-great-grandfather, Samuel Linton, who was arrested in 1887, again in October, around that time of year. And he was sentenced to prison and served. And here's the documents that shows the whole idea here. And so this is the documents that were created. Here's the interesting thing. First of all, the story, the issue that he had been arrested for cohabitation or polygamy was not something that anybody in my family talked about. In other words, it was not even a discussion. And there are lots of reasons for that. We could go into that at great lengths. So when I found the first idea that he had been arrested for cohabitation or polygamy, then I started looking for the records. And unfortunately, well, he was living in Utah. And I finally understood after doing enough research, and because obviously I had a background in researching court records as an attorney, I went through and discovered that he was not convicted in a Utah court, but in the district court. And so all I had to do was track down the district court records, and they ended up being held in the National Archives branch in Denver, Colorado. So you have a number of different challenges here. Number one challenge is even discovering that the person was arrested or was incarcerated or whatever in any from any reason, from mental health and poverty to murder first degree or whatever. So whatever it was, then you need to be able to identify the court system where the action might have been taken, and that could come from primarily would come from newspaper accounts and those kinds of records. And then what you're looking for at that point is to go to the court record and then discover where those court records were held. So in this case, even though this was the district court for Utah, the records themselves are no longer in Utah. They're being held at the National Archives branch in Denver, Colorado. And so what I had to do was go through the process of requesting these records to be sent and paying the fee and all of that information for obtaining this set of records about this particular incarceration. And this is another picture of the Andersonville prison, and that's the Confederate prison for the Union prisoners. That was a terrible place back in 1864. You might find the court or jail records online, but you have to do extensive research and request the records from a court or prison record. You may have to. In other words, it's not like you're going to just go in a book and look up and there it is and oh, you're through. This could be a real process of following these records. And yes, you may have to begin to understand the terminology, the legal terminology of the process from arrest to charging or indictment. And there's a difference. And then all the preliminary court actions now in the U.S. courts, for example, and then the trial, if there is one, or a plea bargain, if there is one, and then the sentencing, and then the place of the sentence. And the person in the United States can be put into prison. If they're in the federal court system, they can be put into prison in any of the federal prisons. It just happens to be where they have a place for them, and that's where they're going to go. So they don't necessarily end up in the same country, the same state or county even. Okay, so this is kind of the process that you go through to get to there's a question that comes up right now, and that is in prison records in 1920, the U.S. Census that I had, have you come across prison staff? Yes, the prison staff will be there, but the prison staff doesn't live in the prison. So you're not going to find them necessarily in the prison records. That's their employment, and they would be in employment records, but they wouldn't be necessarily in the prison record. They would be in the town where the prison or in the surrounding area where the prison was located. Their prisons that sit out in the middle of the nowhere, and the people who work there travel many miles to go back and forth to work every day, and so they're not going to show up in a census record that tells about the people who are confined in the prison itself. Yes. Do the states keep census records on the incarcerated? Yes. The answer to that is yes. And I haven't gotten into those on any particular one, but they probably do. Where would you find chain gang prisoners? Well, that's a sentencing. Those people are still in a jail. They're still incarcerated. They still have a place where they are kept. The chain gang has to do with what they did during the day. They'd be housed somewhere, which would be the main prison, and then they would be taken out. Like, well, as I grew up in Arizona, I became very familiar with prisoner work parties. They would in Arizona had that was very common. I haven't seen that so much here in Utah in the last years that I've lived here, but in Arizona, it was not unusual to see a prison bus with a bunch of prisoners, and they're off to do road work or clean the freeways or whatever. And that would happen just in somebody in jail. If you were in jail for 30 days, for example, you didn't just sit in jail. They put you to work. You went out and cleaned the freeways, or you cleaned parks, or you painted stuff or whatever. So it wasn't unusual to find that situation. But yes, there will be court records. Okay, so another thing that's important to mention here, and we're getting close to the end here, and I have some sources here and things to go through. Just one short note. The records of the prison are going to be separate records that you're going to have to track down. They're not necessarily going to be something that is readily available. So the tip-off can come when you find them in the census record. This is an interesting one. This is the Utah State Hospital, which is here in Provo, Utah, was the Utah Territorial Insane Asylum from 1885 to 1960. The people were buried in unmarked graves. Okay, so this is your question about can't find the burial record. The answer is they did not record the burial. They were buried in unmarked graves. It took a tremendous amount of research on part of some people here in Provo to identify the people. And they have a kind of a mass grave over in the Provo City Cemetery. And they have erected a monument with the names of all the people that they've been able to identify. And so this happens occasionally. I mentioned poorhouses and workhouses. There's a huge number of workhouse records in England and poorhouses. And there's a workhouse records and archives website, workhouses.org in England. And they're valuable sites for finding the people who ended up into that system of incarceration. I just mentioning the Family History Guide to find out that we cover a lot of different topics. And here's a blog that was published, originally I published, and which was copied again into the Family History Guide blog on finding your ancestors in poorhouses and poor farms. And this is another thing that happened. We don't have those so much today. Today, we just call them homeless, and we have a difficult problem. Okay, well, thanks for watching. Appreciate your patience with this subject. If I didn't get a chance to answer all the questions, here's what I would suggest. I would suggest sending your question directly to the BYU Library Family History Center. I go to our website, which comes up on our page where you log into this and all this information. Send those to me, and I'd be glad to answer them and get back with you by email if I didn't completely answer a question. To find out this information, you follow the process. You've just got to identify the place where they might have been arrested, probably somewhere near where they live, maybe not, and then figure out the court that the records were in. And those court records may very well, they may not be online. And if they do find them in a prison record, for example, from the census, then those records you're just going to have to find and research. This is basic, fundamental genealogical research and looking for records that aren't in somebody's easy index or online in one of the large websites. Okay, well, thank you all for watching.